In 1983, after Congress had established the National Council on Disability, at that time it was called National Council on the Handicapped, the president appointed 15 people. They were confirmed by the Senate. Those people were members of the council, and they hired me as the executive director to manage the agency. We produced a report called Toward Independence. The report was based on hearings all over the country, on interviews with people with disabilities. And the report really represented 2 years of work by the agency. So in January 1986, we were scheduled to present this report to the president, and we expected President Reagan then to endorse our proposal that people with disabilities should be protected from discrimination on the basis of disability, and that we should have equal opportunity. We were glad to have the opportunity to go to the West Wing and present our report. On the morning that we did so, the Vice President met us, he greeted us. We had our photographs taken, and we expected to be excused. But the Vice President said, "Would you all please sit down with me? I'd like to discuss this proposal that you've made." He said, "Barbara and I read the preview of your report last night, and we're very interested in it." The National Council on Disability was made up of 15 members appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Since all of these members were appointed by President Reagan, most of the disability community considered them to be ultra-conservative and not generally interested in civil rights issues, particularly those pertaining to people with disabilities. But what the community didn't realize is that every one of those people either had a child with a disability, or they were very close to people with disabilities through their work, or they had a disability themselves. And so they could relate to the work that we, the disability community in general, were promoting at the time, to have a bill that would be passed and signed that would create non-discrimination rules for people with disabilities. This was a real challenge for these conservative members, because they also had to be concerned about the Congress at the time. One of the houses was Republican, and that gave us some challenges. But the fact is, since we had that to begin with, we were able to go out and look for bipartisan supporters of the bill. And the bill, as you recall, was introduced at first by the only independent member of the Senate, who was Lo Weicker from Connecticut, who had a child with a disability, coincidentally, and who voted with the Republicans. So that bill, while it was revised after the Congress expired in 1988 and reintroduced by Senator Harkin, who then represented the majority party after the election, the bill had broad support from Republicans up and down the line, since it was regarded as a Republican initiative. And because President Bush then was a supporter of the bill, we were able to pull together resources and support from across the board. And we had a lot of support until it came to final passage. And then there were debates about transportation and whether intercity buses, for example, needed to be made accessible. And there were debates about the impact of the potential law on small business, and whether small businesses would have the resources, the money available to do the construction projects that they perceived would be required by the ADA. Fortunately, we had already thought of that, and we had a provision in the bill that would allow for reasonable accommodation, and we were able to negotiate compromises in the transportation and small business areas that enabled those groups ultimately to support final passage of the bill. It also required a lot of effort by advocates and family members to encourage Congress not to back off when the questions were raised. And that also culminated, I would say, in the Capitol crawl, which history will record occurred shortly before the houses of Congress voted to pass the ADA. George Bush was elected president of the United States, and on his first public statement before the joint session of Congress, he said in his administration he wanted to sign a bill creating equal opportunity for people with disabilities. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Washington time, millions of people around the world were exposed to the notion that people with disabilities were disenfranchised and that something in law could be done to help protect them. That was the lead story in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and newspapers around America. But because it was the primary lead story on the worldwide network of news, the ADA signing went live, and people all over the world, every country of the world, were exposed to the Americans with Disabilities Act. To me, that was a significant undertaking. We have a lot to be thankful for, and particularly for the intuitive sense that George Bush had about the importance of our proposal in 1986.